Okay guys, go ahead and get out your social studies book and your vocabulary notebook, and then open up to a clean page in your vocabulary notebook. Today we are going to be talking about chapter 8, lesson 2. So that is the title of your notes. Make sure to write that in the big empty white space at the top, and do not forget the date. So last week we talked about the geography and climate of the Midwest, and this week on Monday we talked about the geography and climate of the Midwest. So now we're going to learn about the history of the Midwest. Before we start, let's go ahead and look at that timeline at the top of page 254 in your textbook. That's page 254. So we start this timeline at about 1500 and it goes all the way to the present. We can see that all of these red dots for events that happened in the history of the Midwest all happen a little later, after 1750. That's because, as we know, immigrants traveled to the east coast of the United States and then started to move west. So they started on the east in about the 1500s, and then it took them about 200 years to start really traveling further and further west. So that's why a lot of these historical things that we see on this timeline happen a little later. So we see what happened first was in 1783, the Central Plains became part of the United States. So up until then, they were either territories or uncharted or undiscovered land, at least by the Europeans. I mean, Native Americans had been there for many, many years before, but Europeans had not necessarily traveled that far, or they were still territories. And then in 1787, the Northwest Ordinance passed, which we will talk about in this lesson. And then in 1803, the Louisiana Purchase makes the Great Plains part of the United States. Okay, so let's go ahead and read, and as we read, we will add our vocabulary. Make sure you're reading along with me. Don't zone out. Make sure you're listening and paying attention. Early history of the Midwest. The year is 1700. You and your little brother sit together in your family's teepee. You feel the ground shaking beneath you. Do you hear that noise? Your brother asks. It's the buffalo, you whisper. You know this sound well. It's the pounding hooves of thousands of buffalo running from your tribe's hunters. If the hunters are successful, there will be meat to cook and hides to prepare for clothing. Before we move on, let's look at this picture at the bottom. The caption says, Sioux camps on the Great Plains in the 1700s might have looked like the one in this illustration. So every chapter, whenever we've done the early history of a region, we've had on this first page, we've had a picture of the very first people that we know of living in the area. And so what I want you to do, this is on your own, is pause this video, and I want you to compare and contrast this picture with the picture from the early history of the Southeast and the early history of the the early history of the Southeast and the early history of the Northeast, and then come back to this video. Okay, so now that you've done that, let's go ahead and keep reading. Early people. Long ago, millions of buffalo roamed the interior plains. For many Native Americans there, buffalo was an important natural resource. Adapting to change. The Sioux were one of the many Native American groups in what is now the Midwest. They lived in villages along the rivers and lakes of the Central Plains. Remember, the Central Plains are the eastern part of the Midwest and a little bit of the western part of the Southeast. Like, we are very close to the Central Plains. The Central Plains are the part of the Midwest that's closer to where we are, closer to the Atlantic Ocean. There, they fished the waters and hunted in the forests. Some also farmed. In time, European settlers came to the area. The Lakota and many other Sioux tribes moved west to the Great Plains. Remember, the Great Plains are the western part of the Midwest, so getting closer to the Pacific Ocean and the western part of the United States. They had to adapt or change their ways of life to survive in the new environment. Okay, so our first word in Chapter 8, Lesson 2 is a word that we've actually talked about in science. It is the word adapt, and it means to change a way of life. So in social studies, it means to change kind of the way that you live, like cultural things. In science, it means your biology is changing. Parts of your body and what you do are changing, as well as where you live and how you live. There are few rivers on the Great Plains, so the Sioux could no longer use canoes to travel. Instead, they captured wild horses and learned to ride them. Horses were first brought to the Americas by European explorers. So remember, we talked about a lot of the northeastern and southeastern Native Americans. Canoes were a major way they traveled. Well, once these Native Americans moved from the Central Plains, where there was a lot of water and they could use them, to the Great Plains, there wasn't as much water, so they couldn't rely on canoes anymore, because there may not have been a river or a stream or anything big enough for a canoe for miles and miles and miles. So then they started to use these wild horses, which had initially been brought by the Europeans, but either escaped or let go and then became wild and had babies who were also wild. The Sioux did not build permanent villages or farms on the Great Plains. They moved from place to place, following herds of buffalo. At each place, they set up teepees. And so that's why if we look at this picture at the bottom, we see these teepees. Instead of, remember in the, which you should have just looked, in the northeastern and southeastern picture, they had these permanent structures that had wooden walls and actual roofs. Whereas those, you would not be able to just pick them up and move them when you needed. Teepees, you can see, you could probably roll them up, take them down, roll them up, and put them on a wagon or carry them some way that they developed in order to move them from place to place. Because unlike in the Central Plains and the Southeast and the Northeast, they didn't really rely on farming as much, and also the animals moved from place to place. Whereas in the Northeast and the Southeast, there were usually always animals around. In the Great Plains, those buffalo that they came to rely on moved. So the Sioux Indians had to follow the buffalo in order to have enough food and materials to live their lives. Like other Great Plains groups, the Sioux used buffalo for most of their needs. They ate buffalo meat. They used the skins to make teepees, clothing, and blankets. They also made tools, needles, and arrowheads from the bones and horns. Okay, so now what we're going to do, we're going to do the reading check. Remember, I asked the question, you pause the video, answer it in your notebook underneath the last vocabulary word, and then you come back and check. How did the Sioux depend on buffalo? Well, if you answered they ate buffalo meat and used the skins to make teepees, clothing, and blankets, and bones and horns to make tools, needles, and arrowheads, then you are correct. They relied on those buffalo for almost anything that they needed. Okay, let's go ahead and turn the page, and we'll keep reading. Before we start reading on page 256, let's look at this timeline at the top. I have it up here, so that if you're not sure where I'm talking about, you can look at where I'm pointing up on the board, and then you can find it in your book. So first, in order to find out what this timeline is about, we have to find the title. The title is right at the top left, and it is Exploring the Midwest. That means this timeline is going to be all about people exploring the Midwest. There may not be much about settlements or the United States owning or becoming owners of certain things, but there is going to be a lot about explorers and when they went and what happened while they were there. So our timeline starts at the year 1600 and ends at the year 1800. So that means all of these events happened between the year 1600 and the year 1800, not before and not after. So what we see is we see these little colored dots next to each year, and then down at the bottom we see another colored dot. So that means this green dot goes with this green dot. So that's where this event comes in the timeline. Then we have a purple dot, which matches this purple dot, so that means that's where this event came in the timeline. Then towards the other end we have a blue dot, which matches to this blue dot. So these events, this is where this event happened in our timeline, and then we have our last orange dot, which is the last thing that happened and goes with this orange dot. The reason they probably did that is because if they actually put this event here and this event here, they would not have enough space to write the whole sentence about it. So let's start at 1600 and move along our timeline, and then when we get to an event, we'll stop and we'll read about it. So the first thing that happened is this green dot. So in 1673, Jacques Marquette and Louis Joliet explored the upper Mississippi River and Lake Michigan. So that means they were exploring the northern part of what became the Northwest Territory, probably around Illinois and Michigan, because that is where Lake Michigan is, and northern Illinois, eastern Michigan are right along the border of Lake Michigan. Now if we keep and then also Wisconsin was probably in there as well. So this was probably a lot of Wisconsin, northern Illinois, and Michigan where they were exploring. As we keep going along, we get to the purple dot, which stands for 1962, when Sieur de La Salle traveled down the Mississippi River to its mouth at the Gulf of Mexico. So that means he traveled all the way down south, up from probably Minnesota and Wisconsin area, all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. We see that all of these men have French names. You may not have known that, but these are French names. And what do we know about who owned the Louisiana Purchase, which where a lot of these areas are? Who owned that? Who owned the Louisiana Purchase before we did? It was the French. So these French men traveled to these areas before European men. They probably came down from Canada, and then they explored these areas. Then as we move along, we have a period of not too much exploration, and then we get to the blue dot, which we see that in 1764, French fur traders from St. Louis found St. Louis in what is now Missouri. So again, we know the French owned the Louisiana Purchase before us, so we have French fur traders that founded the city of St. Louis in what is now Missouri. Now that doesn't mean they just found it, they stumbled upon this bustling city. This means they founded as in they started it. And then we move along and we get to the last event on this timeline, which matches this orange dot for 1784, and it says Jean-Baptiste Point du Sable builds the first permanent settlement in the Chicago area. So we have a whole lot of French explorers that explored the Midwest. Up until now, we've only read about European explorers and a few Spanish explorers when we were talking about the southeast. But the Midwest was largely explored by the French, and then the English, or the Europeans, which is now the United States, bought it from the French. Okay, so using this timeline, when was the first permanent settlement built in the Chicago area? Well, we know that it was 1784 because it literally says that in 1784, Jean-Baptiste Point du Sable built the first permanent settlement in the Chicago area. Okay, now we're done with the timeline, so let's go ahead and keep reading on page 256. The Old Northwest. European explorers and traders began traveling to the Central Plains in the 1600s. They built forts along the region's waterways so they could trade with the Native Americans. The Northwest Territory. Over the years, different European countries fought wars over control of the Central Plains and its resources. In 1783, most of the region became part of the United States. The northern Central Plains became known as the Northwest Territory. The Ohio River, the Mississippi River, and the Great Lakes formed its boundaries. So, we talked about the Northwest Territory before. Well, this was before this was around the time that these states became part of the United States. They called it the Northwest Territory. We actually saw that on an earlier map, I think in the history of the Southeast, because we had a map of the United States, and we could see the Northwest Territory to the side. So that was the northern central plains. So like the Mississippi River was a border to the east. The Great Lakes were a border to the north, and the Ohio River was a border to the southeast. No, I'm sorry, the Mississippi River was a border to the west. So we had kind of a triangle. We had the Mississippi River on the west, the Great Lakes, why do I keep forgetting that term? The Great Lakes to the north, and then the Ohio River to the east. It was like a triangle. Here's the Great Lakes. I'm not going to draw them. Here is the Mississippi River going all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. And then here is the Ohio River, and all of this area was the Northwest Territory. Okay, so that means states like Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Ohio, and Ohio were part of the Northwest Territory. Thousands of settlers rushed to settle on the territory's fertile lands. Sometimes, two settlers claimed the same land and arguments broke out. United States leaders decided to control the settling of the Northwest Territory. There was too many people coming. There were fights and arguments and duels breaking out all over the place. So the United States decided that they needed to get involved to stop this from happening. First, they sent workers to survey or measure the territory. So let me go ahead and erase this. And then number 2, which you should be writing underneath the answer to your reading check, is the word survey. And survey is a verb that means to measure land. Then the government divided the land into squares called townships. Each township was divided into 36 smaller square sections to be sold to settlers. So our next word is the word township. And township is a small square of land decided by the government. So a township is kind of like a small town or a small city, except that the government came in and created these borders for the people. Instead of the people deciding where the end of the land was, the government came in and did that. In 1787, the government passed the Northwest Ordinance. The ordinance, or set of laws, described how the territory's government would work. It also explained how new states would be formed there. So, number 4 is the word ordinance. Finally, one I get to spell with an A, which I always want to do for some reason. And an ordinance is a set of laws. So all of this that we just read came about because the United States added this piece of land, the Northwest Territory, to its land that it already had. And what happened was people who were getting tired of the overcrowded cities along the eastern coast and wanted more land and new opportunities started heading out to this Northwest Territory. But too many were going, and they didn't know how to control themselves or to make it work. Like they did not have government minds or anything like that. They just wanted the land, and they wanted to be able to create farms. So people started arguing, fighting, not so good things were happening, and there was really no law to anything, and things were going really, really badly. So then the government came in, and first of all, they measured land and created townships, and then they created the Northwest Ordinance that told people how the government and how laws would work where they lived. So they came in, and even though this wasn't necessarily, they weren't states yet, they were just a territory, the government still came in and they created the laws for this area because the people there were not doing it themselves. They created the towns, they created the areas of land, or they didn't create the, but they created the borders of the land, and then they gave them the Northwest Ordinance, or this set of laws. It also told them how new states could be formed. So that meant that people just couldn't go and argue their way into making and fight their way into new states. They had to follow this set of laws. Life on the frontier. At this time, the Northwest Territory was part of the nation's frontier, or the lands beyond settlement. So, number 5 is the word frontier, and it means lands beyond settlement. And that means people had not started to live there yet. It wasn't like the Northwest Territory where people had come and they'd started to create farms and build houses for themselves. The frontier was nobody had settled there yet. People had explored it and set up temporary camps, but nobody was really living, no Europeans were really living there yet, and they had not created towns or settlements or permanent places that people could stay or live. Like Native Americans in the region, settlers had to use the resources around them to survive in this wilderness. So this isn't like now when we go and explore and we have a backpack full of things like a stove and food that we've brought that will last, and trunks and cars and suitcases and whatever full of things that we need to survive. This wasn't like that. They didn't have that type of stuff yet. So just like the Native Americans, these settlers had to go and they had to rely on what was around them. They had to rely on the finding food in the area where they were. And remember, they weren't in permanent settlements, so they couldn't necessarily create farms. So they had to rely on the animals for meat. They had to rely on berries and natural fruits, mostly fruits, natural things that they could eat. They didn't have what we have now when we go and explore or camp or whatever. They had to rely on the land around them. Much of the Northwest Territory had thick forests of oak and hickory. Settlers chopped down some of these trees to build log cabins. After building their cabins, settlers cleared more trees and bushes to make room for crops. Corn and other crops grew well in the fertile soil of the Central Plains. Livestock grazed on the tall grasses. Settlers also hunted deer, rabbits, and other animals in the forests. So, over time, this frontier, or this land that was not settled yet, became settled. As more and more people explored and pushed the borders of the frontier further and further back, then that's when people came in and they started building permanent structures, and they started planting farms and things like that. So at first there was nothing there. Everybody had to rely just on what was around them. But over time, as that frontier got smaller and smaller, that land beyond settlement, then people started to be able to create things that they could actually use for a long time. Settlers and Native Americans. As many settlers took land from the Native Americans, fights broke out. The United States sent troops to help settlers fight the Native Americans. Some tribes joined together to fight them. Shawnee Chief Tecumseh said, "A single twig breaks, but the bundle of twigs is strong." And what he meant by that was, we just read that some tribes joined together. So what Tecumseh means is that a single twig or a single tribe all by itself breaks or falls apart or loses. Whereas the bundle of twigs, or the group of tribes that are working together, is strong. That means when the tribes worked together, they were able to keep some of their land, at least for a little while, and they were able to fight back without immediately losing. Over time, the Native Americans lost most of their land to settlers or treaties. Many moved out of the region, ending traditional ways of life. Frontier settlements spread across the entire interior plains. So what happened was all of these Native Americans that had lived there for years and years and maybe even centuries of time were forced out by the Europeans, to where eventually they just had these little small areas of land called reservations where they could live, and the European settlers and the Americans took over the area around them. And this is still almost true to this day. There are still Native American reservations where Native Americans can move off the reservations, but if they want to live their most traditional life, they stay on the reservation, and things don't go so well for them because of what happened all these years ago. Okay, so now we're going to do this reading check. I'll ask the question, you'll write the answer underneath number 5, and then you'll play the video to see if you're correct. Where was the Northwest Territory? Well, the Northwest Territory was in the northern Central Plains. The Great Lakes, the Ohio River, and the Mississippi River formed its boundaries. So remember, it was like that little triangle that I drew on the board, where the Great Lakes are the northern border, the Mississippi River is the western border, and the Ohio River is the eastern and southern border. Before we turn the page, let's look at this Children in History box at the bottom of page 257. Growing up on the frontier. Everyone on the frontier had to work to survive, including children. Abraham Lincoln and his parents moved to the Northwest Territory in 1816. They settled in what is now Indiana. It was a wild region with many bears and other wild animals still in the woods. Lincoln later remembered, even though he was only 7 years old, Abe did a lot of work. He cleared trees and bushes and split logs for firewood. He helped his father build their log cabin and helped plant and harvest their crops. Many people today think Lincoln's frontier experiences helped him become a great president. So what I want you to do is, underneath the reading check about the Northwest Territory, I want you to answer this question in your notebook. How might hard work help make a good leader? So answer that question, pause this video, answer that question in your notebook, and then play to check your answer. Okay, so the answer is, or a possible answer is, that a leader who is used to hard work might understand that hard work is necessary to solve problems and make changes, whereas somebody who's always had it easy may just expect things to work without putting much work into it. So reading this, we see that Abraham Lincoln and other children of the frontier had to do a lot of work. They had to help build things and help farm and help to create fires and all this thing. It doesn't leave much time for school. That's because back then, most children of the frontier didn't really spend much time, if any, in school. Sometimes there was a school nearby, and some children would go, but some children, there was too much work to be done at home, so their parents couldn't send them to school, otherwise they wouldn't have any help. Some may have gone for a little bit, but not long. School was not as important to the people back then as it is now. Which, you know, it's a little bit understandable because it was so much harder to survive than it is now. Nowadays, we don't really have to do much work to keep our homes running. Our parents don't even have to do as much because builders come and build our homes. Repair people come and repair things. We don't need fires to cook or for heat because we have heaters and we have stoves and microwaves and ovens. So it's a lot easier now to go to school, so that's why school has become so important. Back then, other children like Abraham Lincoln maybe learned to read and write and do math whenever they could spare time from doing work. Sometimes it never happened. We actually read in religion about, or maybe you'll read it. Nope, I won't say it because we're actually going to you're going to talk about something in religion today where a lot of people didn't know how to read and write, and so they asked somebody for help. It was a similar situation back then. Some were able to learn to read and write and do math, some never did. Okay, now let's go ahead and turn the page, and let's keep reading. Pioneer spirit. In 1803, the United States bought a huge territory from France. The Louisiana Purchase, as it became known, doubled the size of the United States. The nation now owned much of the Great Plains. So up until this point, the areas to the west of the Mississippi River were not really explored. They did not belong to the United States. In fact, some of it didn't belong to anybody because they didn't even know it was there. So at this time, in 1803, the United States bought this massive area of land that France had owned up until that point that included much of the country from the Mississippi River to the west. Not all of it, but most of it. Again, in that same picture where we saw the Northeast Territory, in chapter 6, we also saw the Louisiana Purchase. It was huge. It spread west from the Mississippi River almost across the whole country. So that added a massive amount of land to what is the United States, to the country the United States. Attracting settlers. At first, few settlers wanted to move to the Great Plains. Most thought the region was too dry to farm or to live in. It was also far away from most cities and other settled areas. To attract settlers, the United States government passed the Homestead Act in 1862. This law gave land to any head of a family who was over 21 years old and who would live in the land for 5 years. Thousands of pioneers soon headed to the Great Plains. A pioneer is a person who first settles a place. So, number 6 is the word pioneer. And a pioneer is a person who first settles a place. Now, that doesn't mean that the very first person who gets to an area is the only one who's a pioneer. It's the group of people. But if we're talking about one pioneer, we're just talking about one of those people. Pioneers would be the whole group of people that were the first to move out to this area that was added by the Louisiana Purchase. Now, of course, people didn't really want to do it at first. They knew it would be hard. They knew it would be really, really hard. And if you're comfortable in your life, you don't necessarily want to do something that's going to make it much harder just to change it up. So that meant the United States they needed people to live there. They needed people to settle it. They wanted it to become more like the East Coast. So the United States passed an act, a law, called the Homestead Act, that gave people, anyone who was over 20, that was the head of a family, so the man, who was over 21 years old and who promised to live there for 5 years, it gave them a plot of land. They didn't have to buy it. They just got it. So thousands of people were like, I want that free land. Even though it's going to be hard, it's free land. I can start a farm. And they took their families to the Great Plains and they claimed this plot of land given to them by the government in the Homestead Act. Life on the Great Plains. Most pioneers lived far from towns and stores. Their closest neighbors were often miles away. That's actually still true in some places in this area of the United States. For these reasons, pioneer families had to be self-sufficient, which means they had to do almost everything for themselves. So, number 7 is the word self-sufficient. Make sure you spell it right and don't forget that dash. Self-sufficient, and it means that they had to do almost everything for themselves. That means they had to do their own farming. They had to build their own houses and structures. They had to find their own food. They had to grow their own food. They had to hunt their own food. They had to make their own clothes. The things that they didn't necessarily, what they could do is they could order things from stores that were far away. Like maybe once a month, they would go and they would spend hours traveling to a town that was somewhat nearby, which maybe nowadays would only take us like 30 or 40 minutes. But back then, they only had horses and wagons, so they would take hours to go into town, and they would buy some of the things they needed, like dishes and tools and fabric for clothing. But then they had to make things out of these fabric or these tools themselves. Like sometimes they could buy supplies for building houses. But they'd have to bring it back to their settlement, and they'd have to build it and put it together and do all of that kind of thing themselves. Pioneers made just about everything they needed. With few trees available, most people used sod to build their houses. Sod is a layer of soil held together by the roots of grasses. So our last vocabulary word for this lesson is the word sod. And it means a layer of soil held together by the roots of grasses. We still have sod today, but the funny thing is, what we use sod for now is the grass. We put that layer of dirt held together by the roots of grasses down on maybe bare patches of land in order to make grass grow there. Well, back in the day, they didn't really care about the grass. They only cared about the grass because it held the sod together, which then they could use to make structures. So if you look at this house on the bottom, we actually see a sod house. It says this photograph from the 1800s shows a pioneer family in front of their sod house. And you can see on the roof there is grass. That's because they only cared about the grass because it held together that dirt, which kept their shelter from rain and water and dust and all that kind of thing getting in. Nowadays, we don't care about the dirt, we care about the grass. We just need the dirt to keep all the grass together. So we still use sod to this day, but really for a completely different reason. It's kind of funny how things like that happen. Pioneers slept on mattresses filled with straw or corn husks. And most of this straw and corn husks, they got themselves. So they made their own pillows and mattresses. That was one of the things. They might buy the fabric in town when they go, very rarely. But then they come home and they actually made their own pillows and mattresses. Now we can just go to the store and buy those things. Or we can even order them online. Pioneers grew their own food too, including corn, beans, and potatoes. Now the seeds may be something that they bought when they went to town, but they have to grow it themselves. From their farm animals, they had milk, meat, eggs, wool, hides, and materials to make soap and candles. Again, some of the animals they may have bought when they went to town, but then they have to do everything to take care of them and to gather the things that they need in order to make these other things. They couldn't even buy soap or candles. They had to make those out of the animal fat. To get water on the dry Great Plains, settlers dug deep wells. They built large windmills to pump the water. Let's do this reading check. Why did early settlers on the Great Plains need to be self-sufficient? Okay, if you said they were far from cities, towns, and neighbors, you are correct. They were too far away from any of these things to be constantly going to their neighbors or to cities or towns to buy things or borrow things. So they needed to make sure that they could do it themselves. Okay, let's read the summary and then we will be done with this lesson. It says, by 1803, most of the Central Plains and the Great Plains were part of the United States. They weren't necessarily states yet, but they were a part of it. Because remember, a territory is an area of land that's owned and governed by another country. So they were they were owned and governed by the United States, but they were not states yet. The government passed laws to encourage people to settle in those frontier regions. Once there, most pioneers had to rely on themselves to survive. Okay, so that's it for Chapter 8, Lesson 3. You do have homework, which you can go ahead and start on now, or you can wait until later. So go ahead, get out your Friday packet, and turn to the very last page. It looks like this. The title is Early History of the Midwest, and we've done an assignment like this before. I think we did it with the Southeast, or maybe it was the Northeast. I can't remember. But we did do an assignment like this before where you have 10 events and you have to put them in order from 1 to 10. So number 1 is the first event that happened, number 2 is the second, and so on until you get to number 10, which is the last event that happened. Now, just like before, what's going to make this much, much easier and what you have to do is you need to find in your textbook the year that each event takes place. Each of these events, somewhere in the book, you can find an exact year or a general year. Like remember before, we knew one thing had happened after 1610. We didn't know the exact year, but we knew it had happened after 1610 because a few sentences before that, they said that had happened in 1610. And so we knew that had to happen somewhere around there. So in your textbook, you need to find a year or that the event happened or the year that it happened around. Do that first and write it to the side. And then once you have the years for each event, then you can put them in order by just putting the years in order. That will make it much easier. All of these years, or at least a year that is close by, is mentioned in the textbook, in this lesson. You may have to look at timelines, you may have to look at captions. Some of it may be right there in the text, but you need to find the year, write it to the side, then put the events in order. Okay, go ahead and get started.